Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I should have known something was wrong the moment I drove into Eagle Creek Campground. It was day 2 of my 3-week solo camping trip through Oregon, and this place felt different. Too quiet, too empty. Eagle Creek sat 40 minutes down a gravel road from the nearest highway. The camp host barely looked up when I checked in, just circled Site 47 on the map. "Furthest one back," he muttered. "Sah, you'll have privacy." The campsite sat against a wall of massive Douglas firs, so dense that even in daylight it felt dim. I could see maybe 2 other occupied sites in the distance, but they looked abandoned. No cars, no movement. I set up my tent facing the fire pit, but kept glancing at that dark tree line 30 feet away. Just trees, I told myself. The first night passed fine. Good sleep, peaceful fire, exactly what I needed after my divorce. Next morning, I decided to hike the waterfall trail. About 2 miles in, I noticed fresh boot prints ahead of me. Size 10 or 11, deep treads. Another early hiker, I figured. But something bothered me about those prints. They seemed to follow my exact route, always stopping just out of sight. Every time I thought I'd catch up, the trail would bend and the footprints would continue ahead. When I reached the waterfall around noon, I ate lunch alone, constantly scanning the forest. No sign of another person anywhere. The hike back felt different. Those same boot prints were there, but now a second set headed back toward camp. Someone had turned around after I reached the waterfall and was now ahead of me again. I picked up my pace, hoping to catch sight of whoever was sharing the trail, but they stayed just far enough ahead to remain invisible. When I got back to Site 47 around 3 p.m., I knew immediately something was wrong. My camp chair had been moved. I'd left it facing the fire pit. Now it faced directly toward the tree line, positioned perfectly to watch the dark spaces between those trees. I walked the perimeter slowly. Everything else looked normal. Tent zipped, food secure in the bare box, gear untouched, just the chair. Maybe the camp host came by, I reasoned, but the feeling of being watched was getting stronger. As darkness settled, I built up the fire and tried to focus on dinner. Every few minutes I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see a face watching from the shadows. Around 10 p.m. I climbed into my tent. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, just oppressive silence. That's when I heard the first snap. Crack, a branch breaking somewhere behind my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing. The snapping stopped the moment my light came on. I waited 15 minutes. Silence. Crack. 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 3 distinct snaps, evenly spaced. Like someone deliberately breaking branches in a pattern. This time I stayed still, didn't reach for the light. The sound was moving, circling my campsite. Always the same rhythm. 3. Breaks. Pause. Move to a new location. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. The pattern continued for 20 minutes, a slow circle around my site. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard something worse. Footsteps. Not careful movement. Confident steps on the pine needle carpet around my tent. Someone was walking in a circle around my campsite, maybe 15 feet from my tent walls. The footsteps were steady, methodical, like a patrol. This went on for what felt like hours. Then, suddenly, complete silence returned. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn broke, I finally worked up courage to look outside. What I saw made me pack up in record time. Someone had arranged a perfect circle of broken twigs around my entire campsite, not dropped randomly, carefully arranged. dozens of small branches, each placed end to end in a precise circle. But worse than that, in the center where my fire pit had been, someone had used smooth river stones to spell out 2 words. Seen you. My hands shook as I threw everything into my car. At the camp host station, I stopped and rolled down my window. Did you see anyone near Site 47 last night? The old man looked up slowly, studied my face. Nope. Quiet night. Someone was in my campsite. They left messages. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. Site 47's had some issues, he said finally. Previous campers reported strange activity. What kind of strange activity? Same kind you probably experienced. He folded his newspaper. We keep it available because it's a good site otherwise. You didn't warn me. You didn't ask. I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was part of it or just tired of scared campers. Forest Service thinks it might be someone living rough out there, he added. They've looked, but... He gestured at the endless wilderness. Lot of forest to hide in. I drove away that morning and didn't stop until I hit the interstate. Even now I can still see those river stones spelling SEENYOU, where my campfire should have been. I never found out who was watching from the tree line or why they chose my site. But I learned something important. Sometimes you're not as alone in the wilderness as you think. And sometimes the things sharing the forest don't want you there. Day 8 of my trip found me near Mount Hood, planning what should have been a simple 3-hour day hike. I'd been feeling more confident after leaving Eagle Creek behind, telling myself that first experience was just bad luck. The trailhead parking was empty when I arrived at 7 a.m. Perfect weather, clear skies, and according to my map, the trail led to a viewpoint with spectacular mountain views. 3 hours in, I realized I'd missed a trail marker somewhere. My phone showed no signal. The path I'd been following had gradually turned from maintained trail to what looked like an old logging road. No trail signs, no markers, just rutted dirt heading deeper into the forest. Don't panic, I told myself. Follow it back the way you came. But after an hour of backtracking, nothing looked familiar. The logging road branched off in several directions, and I couldn't remember which route I'd taken. The sun was getting low. I had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. I decided to follow what looked like the most used road, hoping it would lead to a highway or at least a Forest Service station. The ruts were deep, suggesting vehicles still used this route regularly. After another hour of walking, I came across a building. It was a small Forest Service maintenance shed. Windows boarded up with plywood, but the structure looked sound. More importantly, there were fresh tire tracks in the mud outside. I walked around the building, looking for any signs or information that might help me figure out where I was. That's when I noticed the gap between 2 boards covering one of the windows. I peered through and immediately stepped back. The shed wasn't abandoned. Someone had been living there recently. I could see sleeping bags laid out on the floor, camping chairs arranged around a makeshift table, stacks of canned food, and several flashlights. Fresh food wrappers were scattered around, and the whole place had that lived-in smell. Homeless person, I figured. Someone using an abandoned building for shelter. I was about to continue down the road when I heard the distant rumble of an engine. My first instinct was relief. A vehicle meant people. And people meant I could get directions back to civilization. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the secretive setup inside the shed, or maybe it was just paranoia left over from Eagle Creek. I ducked behind the building just as a rusted pickup truck came around the bend. The truck moved slowly, deliberately. The driver was scanning the woods on both sides of the road like he was looking for something, or someone. I pressed myself against the back wall of the shed, trying to stay hidden. Through a gap in the boards, I watched the truck approach. It stopped directly in front of the shed. The engine cut off. I heard the truck door slam, then heavy footsteps on gravel. Whoever it was walked straight to the front door of the shed and went inside. I could hear movement inside the building, someone rummaging around, moving things. Then the footsteps came back outside, but instead of returning to the truck, they started walking around the perimeter of the building. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure whoever it was would hear it. The footsteps stopped right on the other side of the wall I was pressed against. I could hear heavy breathing just a few feet away, separated only by weathered wood. Then I saw a flashlight beam sweep through the gap in the boards I'd looked through earlier. The light moved methodically, checking every corner of the woods visible from that window. He's looking for someone, I realized, and he thinks they might be hiding nearby. I held my breath, pressed flat against the wall. The flashlight beam moved away from the gap, but the breathing continued right on the other side of the boards. This went on for what felt like forever. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. I lost track of time, focused only on staying completely still and quiet. Finally, I heard footsteps moving away from the building. The truck door slammed again, and the engine turned over. But instead of driving away, the truck just sat there idling. I waited and waited. The engine kept running, but the truck didn't move. Occasionally, I'd hear the driver's door open and close, followed by footsteps walking around outside. He knows someone's here, I thought. He's waiting for them to make a move. Darkness was falling fast. I was trapped behind this shed, afraid to move, afraid to make any noise that might give away my position. Around midnight, the truck finally drove away. I waited another hour before creeping around to the front of the building. The door to the shed was now propped open, and someone had left a battery-powered lantern glowing inside, like an invitation or a trap. I didn't stick around to find out which. I followed the maintenance road in the opposite direction the truck had gone, walking through the forest in complete darkness. My phone's flashlight app helped, but I was terrified of using too much battery. It took me until 4 a.m. to finally reach a paved highway. I flagged down the first car I saw, a long-haul trucker heading south, and asked him to call the Forest Service. The next day, I mentioned my experience to a ranger at the Mount Hood Visitor Center. Her expression changed immediately when I described the location. "Can you show me exactly where this was on the map?" I pointed to the area where I thought the maintenance road had been. "We've had reports of individuals living off-grid in that area," she said carefully. "People engaging in concerning behavior. We advise hikers to avoid those old logging roads entirely." "What kind of concerning behavior?" She hesitated. "Let's just say we've had missing persons reports from people who were last seen hiking in that area. I never found out who was in that pickup truck or what they were looking for in the woods that night, but I learned another lesson about wilderness safety. Not all the dangers come from wildlife. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the human ones, living in places where no one thinks to look for them. By day 14 of my trip, I thought I'd put the worst experiences behind me. Eagle Creek and that maintenance road encounter had shaken me, but I was determined not to let fear ruin the rest of my wilderness adventure. Pine Lake was supposed to be different. It was a dispersed camping area in Washington state, meaning no established campsites, but also no weird camp hosts or abandoned buildings. Just me, a pristine alpine lake, and miles of untouched forest. I found the perfect spot about 30 feet from the water's edge, where a small clearing provided enough space for my tent and a clear view across the lake. The water was mirror smooth, reflecting the surrounding peaks perfectly. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, I felt completely at peace. I set up camp in the late afternoon, gathered some firewood, and prepared for what I hoped would be a quiet, restorative evening. The lake was maybe half a mile across, surrounded by dense forest and rocky outcroppings. No roads, no other campers, no signs of human presence anywhere. This is what I came for, I thought as I watched the sun set over the water. I cooked dinner as the stars came out, brighter than I'd ever seen them. The silence was complete. No traffic noise, no aircraft, not even wind. Just the occasional gentle lap of water against the shore. Around 10 p.m., as I was banking the fire for the night, I noticed ripples spreading across the lake's surface. That seemed odd, since there was no wind at all. I assumed it was fish feeding or maybe a deer coming down to drink on the far shore. I was settling into my sleeping bag when I heard it. Splash. Someone or something had entered the water. Not the quick splash of an animal drinking, but the slow, deliberate sound of something wading in. I unzipped my tent entrance and looked across the lake. The surface was disturbed in a rough line leading from the far shore toward the center of the water, like something was moving just below the surface. Beaver, I told myself. Or maybe a large fish jumping. But the disturbance was moving in too straight a line, too purposeful, and it seemed to be getting closer to my side of the lake. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it across the water. The beam reached maybe 50 feet before being swallowed by darkness, not nearly enough to illuminate the far shore. The splashing stopped immediately when my light hit the water. I kept the beam moving across the lake's surface for several minutes, but saw nothing. Just calm water reflecting my flashlight beam back at me. Definitely an animal, I decided, spooked by the light. I clicked off the flashlight and crawled back into my sleeping bag. The lake returned to perfect silence. At 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of my tent shaking. Not violent shaking like wind or an animal bumping into it. Gentle, rhythmic movement, like someone was softly pushing on the tent walls from outside. I lay perfectly still, listening. The shaking continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped. Complete silence. I waited 5 minutes, then carefully unzipped the entrance and looked outside. Clear, still night, no wind at all. The lake surface was perfectly smooth, like glass. Must have been dreaming, I told myself, though I was wide awake now. I was about to close the tent when the shaking started again. This time I could feel it more clearly. Someone was gently pushing on the side of my tent, making the whole structure sway slightly. But when I looked outside, there was no one there. I don't usually ask, but if this story is getting under your skin, show it some love. It really helps. The tent stopped shaking the moment I opened the entrance, like whatever was causing it had immediately moved away. I grabbed my flashlight and did a complete circle around my campsite. Nothing. No footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, no signs that anyone or anything had been near my tent. But as I completed the circle, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Wet footsteps. The unmistakable sound of someone walking with soaking wet feet, leaving puddles with each step. The footsteps started near the lake's edge and began moving in a slow circle around my campsite. I could hear the squelch of waterlogged shoes on the pine needle carpet and the soft splash of water dripping with each step. I spun around with my flashlight, trying to track the sound, but the beam never caught anything. The footsteps stayed just outside the reach of my light, circling my camp like a predator. Someone came out of the lake, I realized with horror. They're walking around my campsite, dripping wet. The circling continued for what felt like hours. Slow, patient steps, always staying just beyond my flashlight's reach. Occasionally, the footsteps would stop, and I'd hear water dripping onto dry pine needles. Then they'd resume their endless circle. I stood in the entrance of my tent, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, slowly turning to track the sound. But I never saw anything. Just heard those wet footsteps going around and around my campsite in the darkness. Then, just before dawn, the footsteps stopped. Not gradually, not by moving away. They just stopped, like whoever was making them had simply vanished. I waited until full daylight before venturing outside my tent. What I found nearly made me sick. Wet footprints led from the lake's edge directly to my tent, then circled it dozens of times before heading straight back into the water. The prints were clearly human, but something was wrong with them. They were too wide, with the toes spread unnaturally far apart, and they showed that whoever made them had walked backwards into the lake as if they never intended to come ashore permanently, only to visit. Most disturbing of all, the footprints going back to the lake showed that the person had walked backwards the entire way, never turning around, like they wanted to keep watching my tent even as they returned to the water. I packed up in record time and hiked back to my car. It wasn't until I was driving down the mountain that I realized something that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. Pine Lake was a high alpine lake, fed by snow melt. Even in summer, the water temperature probably never got above 50 degrees. No one could survive in that water for more than a few minutes, let alone spend hours walking around soaking wet in the middle of the night. Whatever visited my campsite that night wasn't entirely human. Or maybe it was human once, but had been in that cold, dark water far too long. Day 21 was supposed to be the end of my wilderness adventure. 3 weeks of solo camping had been more intense than I'd bargained for, and I was ready to return to civilization. For my final night, I chose Cascade Gorge Campground in Northern California. After the isolated experiences I'd had, I wanted the comfort of other people nearby. Established campground, camp host on site, multiple occupied sites. Everything I'd been avoiding but now desperately needed. Cascade Gorge had about 15 sites arranged in a loop with a camp host station near the entrance. Midweek in late season meant it wasn't crowded. Maybe 3 or 4 other campers scattered around the loop. I picked Site 12, close to the camp host station, and within sight of at least 2 other occupied sites. After weeks of isolation, the sound of other voices and the glow of other campfires felt incredibly reassuring. I set up my tent and started preparing what I planned to be a celebration dinner. 3 weeks in the wilderness, some scary moments, but I'd made it through. One more night and I'd be heading home. The evening started perfectly. Other campers were having quiet dinners. The camp host walked his evening patrol around 8 p.m. and everything felt normal and safe. Around 9 p.m., I noticed one of the other campers looking in my direction. He was a middle-aged guy, maybe 50, camping alone in Site 7 across the loop from me. Every time I glanced his way, he was staring directly at my campsite. At first, I figured he was just being friendly. Solo campers often acknowledge each other with a nod or a wave. But when I raised my hand in greeting, he didn't wave back. He just kept staring. Probably just antisocial, I thought. Some people come to the woods to avoid other people. But as the evening progressed, his behavior got more unsettling. He never seemed to look away from my sight. Even when I moved around my campfire, his head would turn to track my movement. By 10 p.m., the other campers had packed up and left. It was just me and the staring man. That's when I realized he wasn't just looking at my campsite casually. He was studying it. His eyes would move from my tent to my car to my food storage, like he was memorizing the layout. I tried to ignore him, focusing on cleaning up my dinner dishes and preparing for bed. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Around 11 p.m., I saw him stand up and grab a flashlight. Instead of heading toward the bathroom facilities or his own tent, he started walking around the perimeter of my campsite. Not on the road or the established paths. Through the woods, just outside the tree line that bordered my site. I could see his flashlight beam moving slowly through the trees, and I could hear his footsteps on the pine needles. He was doing a complete reconnaissance of my campsite, staying just in the shadows, but close enough to examine everything. This is not normal, I thought, my heart starting to race. I watched him through my tent window as he moved methodically around my site. At one point, he stopped directly behind my tent and seemed to be examining my guy lines and tent stakes. Then he moved to where I'd stored my food and spent several minutes shining his light on the bear box. When he got to my car, he actually approached it and looked through the windows with his flashlight. I'd had enough. I cleared my throat loudly and called out, "Can I help you with something?" He froze, flashlight still pointed at my car. In the glow of his light, I could see his face clearly for the first time. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile, not an embarrassed smile like someone caught doing something innocent. A predatory smile, like he was enjoying the fact that I'd caught him scouting my campsite. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then, instead of explaining himself or apologizing, he slowly backed away into the darkness, never breaking eye contact. I didn't wait around to see what happened next. I threw everything into my car as quickly as possible, not caring about proper packing or organization. The entire time, I could feel him watching me from somewhere in the darkness beyond the campfire light. I drove straight to a 24-hour truck stop 20 miles away and spent the rest of the night in my car in the well-lit parking lot. The next morning, I called the campground to report what had happened. "I need to report suspicious behavior by another camper last night," I told the camp host. "Which site were you in?" "Site 12. "And which site was the other camper?" "Site 7. There was a long pause. "Sir, we didn't have anyone registered for Site 7 last night. You were our only camper." My blood went cold. "That's impossible. I saw him clearly. Middle-aged guy, camping alone. He was there all evening." "Site 7 has been closed all season due to previous incidents. We've had to trespass someone from the area multiple times, an individual who's been causing problems for other campers." "What kind of problems?" "Let's just say he has an unhealthy interest in solo campers, especially people camping alone in isolated sites." I hung up the phone and sat in my car, trying to process what the camp host had told me. The man who'd been watching me, studying my campsite, examining my gear, he wasn't supposed to be there. He was someone who'd been banned from the campground but kept coming back anyway. Someone who specifically targeted solo campers. I thought about how he'd smiled when I caught him looking through my car windows, how he'd backed away into the darkness instead of explaining himself, how he'd seemed to know the campground layout well enough to move through it in complete darkness. How many other solo campers had he watched? How many had he approached after they'd fallen asleep? I never found out who he was or what he'd planned to do that night, but I learned something that changed how I think about campground safety. Sometimes the most dangerous people aren't hiding in remote wilderness areas. Sometimes they're hiding in plain sight in the places where we go specifically because we think we'll be safe. That was 8 months ago. I haven't been camping since. Sometimes I tell myself I was just stressed, seeing threats that weren't really there, letting isolation and paranoia get the better of me. But then I remember the circle of broken twigs at Eagle Creek, the wet footprints at Pine Lake, and that predatory smile at Cascade Gorge. The wilderness is vast and beautiful, but it's not empty. There are things living in the spaces between the marked trails and established campgrounds. Some of them used to be human, some of them still are, and all of them are watching the people who think they're alone in the woods. Thanks for listening. If you made it through the darkness,